Hello everybody, we have made it to part 3 of Wide Sargasso Sea. This is the final video where we're going to look at the text in depth, and then I think there'll be a couple more videos looking at some of the characters and some of the themes in the novel. So let's get stuck in. Well, part 3, we have some interesting plot developments and discoveries that we make at this point of the novel. So first of all, we have a new character. And this character is called Grace Poole, and we hear her perspective on being hired by another new character, Mrs. Fairfax. Now, to understand who these people are, you really need to have read Jane Eyre or have watched a TV adaptation of Jane Eyre. Mrs. Fairfax is Rochester's housekeeper. She's very loyal to him. She's known him since he was a child, and she's in charge of his house in England, which is called Thornfield Hall. And it seems that the action of the novel now moves over to this place in England. And Grace Poole is hired by Mrs. Fairfax and Rochester to look after Antoinette. Now, Grace Poole is not a particularly respectable character. She's clearly in it for the money, and she drinks way too much and doesn't always take very good care of Antoinette. And then we hear Antoinette describe her life being imprisoned at Thornfield Hall in England. And Antoinette is losing her sense of self and identity. She blames Rochester for renaming her and taking her identity away from her. And then the sequence of events starts to align with those narrated in Jane Eyre. So in Wide Sargasso Sea, Antoinette is able to get out of the room that she's locked in occasionally when Grace Poole drinks too much. Antoinette is able to get the key and get out into the main house. And on one of the occasions that she does so, she sees a girl who, if you've read Jane Eyre, we recognise as being Jane. And there is a couple of incidents in Jane Eyre where Jane thinks that she sees someone out of the corner of her eye, and there's an incident where Jane's wedding veil is ripped in half by somebody who looks like a vampire. And so if you read the two novels side by side, you can start to piece this narrative of Antoinette's life together. There's also an incident in both Wide Sargasso Sea and Jane Eyre where Antoinette attacks her brother Richard Mason. And Richard has come over from the Caribbean to try and protect his sister's interests. He's heard Rochester is going to get married again to this girl called Jane, and he wants to tell everybody that actually Rochester can't because he's already married to Antoinette. Antoinette also hints in part 3 that she's had a romantic relationship with her half-brother Sandi. Now, we've heard a couple of hints about this earlier in the novel, but nothing particularly concrete. And I would say it's not concrete here, but there's certainly a stronger suggestion that she's at least kissed Sandi. And then Antoinette dreams that she finds her way into the main section of Thornfield Hall, that she knocks over some candles that she dislikes, and then she runs through the house, throwing down another candle to set fire to the building. As the house burns, Antoinette recalls the fire that destroyed the house in Colibri that we read in part 1 of the novel. But that's all a dream. Antoinette wakes up from that dream, sees Grace Poole in a drunken sleep, and she picks up a candle and walks into the main house, and that's the way the novel ends. And we know from Jane Eyre, if we align the two texts, if we put the two texts together, that Antoinette or Bertha then burns down Thornfield Hall. And Rochester tries to rescue her, but isn't able to, and Antoinette dies jumping off the top of Thornfield Hall from the roof. In terms of the narrative style then, this final section is approaching something that we might call a stream of consciousness. Now, this is a way of writing that is a representation of the continuous and unexpurgated flow of thoughts and sensations. So if you think about the way you think yourself, it's not particularly linear. It's all kind of mixed up. You might be sitting in a lesson thinking about the work, thinking about what the teacher's saying, what the person beside you is saying. But as well as that, you'll be remembering what you did in a previous lesson, what you did at home that morning, what you had for breakfast, what you said to your mum when you left the house, what happened at break time, what happened 5 years to you previously. All of these thoughts and ideas are kind of jumbled up in our minds all in one go. And so we can never have a kind of single line of thought. And so this stream of consciousness is a way of representing that in a novel form. So one thought flows into another, and there might be 5 or 10 years separating those two different ideas, with one of them being a memory. And so we have to kind of pick our way through this final section of the novel as it becomes more and more confused in this representation of what Antoinette is actually thinking. And so this technique includes things like using short, often verbless sentences, using unanswered questions, unfinished sentences, so we might just get fragments of a sentence rather than a complete sentence, repeating words and structures, rapid shifts in subject matter, links established by association rather than by logic. So for example, if I was teaching a class about Romeo and Juliet and we were talking about love at first sight in Romeo and Juliet, you might remember the first time somebody asked you out. And so it's not necessarily a logical link, but it would be something that you associate with the subject that we're doing at the time. Then we also get lots of different sides to the story in this final section. We get Grace Poole's perspective, we hear Mrs. Fairfax's perspective, and we get Antoinette's perspective. And all the way through the novel, Jean Rhys is presenting us with different ideas, different ways of narrating exactly the same events, so that we question the honesty of any one single character. And this quotation is really significant throughout the novel. There is always the other side, as in there's one person's perspective which is true for them, but someone else might have a similarly true perspective, which is actually different from the first one. So to give you an example of this, from your kind of experience, you might have had an argument with a friend. From your perspective, which is absolutely true for you, you might have been in the right because maybe that friend is, I don't know, betrayed you in some way, or maybe you think they've said something nastily to you. Your friend will have a different perspective, and they are going to think that they are absolutely right and their perspective is true, but it might be different from yours. And that's what we see in the novel as well. In part 2, Rochester is described from his own perspective as a victim of the system. His dad has sent him away, he's arranged this marriage to a woman who he doesn't really know and who turns out to be mad, and Rochester paints himself as a victim who's only ever tried to help Antoinette and who's been pushed to the end of his tether and now has to lock her up. From Antoinette's perspective, she's married this man she doesn't really know, she's been forced into it, and then he has sent her mad. Now, can both of those be true? Possibly. Possibly not. That's one of the things that the novel's asking us. Can we have different truths at the same time? And Mrs. Fairfax in part 3 of the novel provides us with another truth. So she describes Rochester and says that when he was a child, he was gentle, generous, brave. His stay in the West Indies has changed him out of all knowledge. He has grey in his hair and misery in his eyes. Don't ask me to pity anyone who had a hand in that. So she sees Antoinette as being the villain here, Antoinette as having caused all this misery in Rochester's life, and Rochester as being the victim of this situation. And it's just another interesting perspective on this character. And if you're writing essays on this, you need to always take into account the other side of the argument. You know, if you were to focus on Rochester perhaps as a symbol of the colonial patriarch going out to the West Indies and trying to take control of everything that he sees and not listening to other people's perspectives, you could show this as the other side of the argument. You know, actually, maybe it's the system that has forced him to change and become this colonial patriarch. So don't forget to look at the hints that there's always the other side in this novel. And then we have a description of Antoinette's imprisonment, and she says that there's a window high, you cannot see out of it. And this symbolism of the window really resonates throughout the novel. So the window is obviously, when it's closed, it's a barrier between the inside and the outside, between being trapped and being free. The fact that Antoinette can't see out of this window symbolises how she's imprisoned, she's entrapped, and her ability to see the English countryside around her has been removed from her, which is a complete transformation from part 1 of the novel, where she was completely immersed in the natural world. And then here again we've got another mention of the window. I saw Antoinette drifting out of the window with her scents, her pretty clothes and her looking glass. And it's really interesting at the start of this little quotation that Antoinette speaks about herself in the third person. She has, I suppose, what we'd call an out-of-body experience. And this is because she's almost been separated from her own identity. You know, the person who was Antoinette, the person who used to love dressing up and being pretty and going swimming in the pool and being with her husband, that person has been destroyed. That person has drifted out of the window, and what we're left with is Bertha, who's been renamed by her husband, who's been treated with violence, and who is mad. So we almost have a split of Antoinette's personality here, and she's lost the aspect of her personality that she calls Antoinette, and all she's left with is this character called Bertha. This sense of drifting indicates the kind of pointlessness of Antoinette's life, the purposelessness of it. She doesn't see that she's got any direction anymore. And the looking glass is also significant. If in psychoanalytical theory, when you look in a mirror, you kind of get a sense of yourself, and you understand how the thoughts inside your head line up with your physical body as well. And your perception of yourself, your level of attractiveness or your similarity to your parents or whatever physical attributes you're looking at, that gives you a sense of who you are. And for Antoinette, that's been really important, because in a patriarchal society, the thing that is valued is physical attractiveness of women. That's why she's been married off so quickly to Rochester, because she's so beautiful. She's kind of swept him off his feet when he first meets her, and he doesn't notice anything else about her character other than her physical appearance. And now that that looking glass has been taken away from her, she's got no way of reconfirming who she is, no way of confirming that she's just as beautiful as when she first met Rochester. And of course, we know that she's lost that beauty after this long imprisonment. And then Grace Poole talks to her and gives her a really interesting narrative of an event that Antoinette doesn't remember. So Grace Poole says, "You don't remember that you attacked this gentleman with a knife?" "I didn't hear all he said, except, 'I cannot interfere legally between yourself and your husband.' It was when he said legally that you flew at him, and when he twisted the knife out of your hand, you bit him." And here we've got to put Jane Eyre together with Why Sargasso Sea to get a full understanding of what's supposed to be going on in this scene. So this gentleman that Grace Poole is talking about is Richard Mason, who has travelled from the Caribbean to see his sister and find out what's happening to her at Thornfield Hall. And when Richard Mason goes in to visit her, Rochester kind of lets Richard into the room. Antoinette is supposed to attack Richard. That's what happens in Jane Eyre. But here in Why Sargasso Sea, Grace Poole gives us a little bit more information, and that it's the idea of Richard's lack of legal interference that leads to Antoinette's attack on her half-brother. And it's really important that it's this legal prompt that causes Antoinette to become violent, because we've seen elsewhere in the novel that Antoinette is never violent for no reason. That's what Rochester wants to think. But actually Antoinette becomes violent when, for example, her husband is flirting with Amelie. And all that Antoinette can do in response to that, she's tried speaking to Rochester, she's tried reasoning with him, and all she's got left is this act of violence. And what Richard is saying to her when he says, "I cannot interfere legally between yourself and your husband," is that Antoinette is owned by her husband. In this patriarchal society, she has become her husband's property. All of Antoinette's money has been transferred to Rochester, and there's nothing that Richard can do about this, or nothing that he wants to do about this. And so this word legally prompts Antoinette to realise the utter horror of her situation. The fact that she's been abandoned, mistreated, transferred in terms of who owns her and who's in charge of her, that she's got no agency or control over her own life. And it's that realisation that prompts her to be violent. She's got no ability to argue with anyone anymore. No one listens to what she says, they just say that she's drunk or that she's mad. And so the only response that she can have to this is a violent response. And then it's interesting here as well that Grace Poole describes Antoinette using animalistic language. Earlier on, other male characters have done this as well, describing Annette, Antoinette's mother, as being like a cat, like a wild cat, describing Antoinette as being like a wild cat, and here the word flew and the word bit really reduce Antoinette to an animalistic character. And we can see that one of the ways that these other people are controlling Antoinette and controlling the money that she has, or that she used to have and has now been transferred to Rochester, is by reducing her to an animal and saying, no, your perspective on this can't possibly be true because your understanding of this world is so limited. You're an animalistic character. And we've seen this kind of increasing all the way through the novel until we have the utter dehumanisation of Antoinette at this point in the novel. And this is one of the reasons that Antoinette goes mad, arguably, that if she's constantly being told that she behaves in an animalistic way, then she's going to react to that by thinking that her identity has been stripped from her, and that in itself will lead to a form of madness. And then another interesting aspect of part 3 is the reference to Sandi, because this kind of questions everything that's gone before in terms of our understanding of Antoinette. So I'm probably guilty of being very much on Antoinette's side, as looking at her as a symbol of victimhood. You know, she's a victim of a patriarchal society. She's been bartered by her brother and Rochester. She's a symbol of victims of a colonial society as well. You know, her life is kind of the product of colonial violence and separation of different races. But here there's a suggestion that actually Antoinette maybe has done some of the unspeakable things that the other characters say about her. You know, they've said that she gets drunk, that she's over-sexualized, that she's got madness running through the family. And all of the way through we've kind of been on Antoinette's side and said, well, actually none of that's her fault, or none of that's really happened. But here there's a hint that actually maybe it has happened. And so Antoinette says, Sandi often came to see me. So Sandi is Antoinette's half-brother. Sandi often came to see me when that man, Mr. Mason, was away, and when I went out driving I would meet him. So this is after she's left the convent and before she's been married to Rochester. She says, I could go out driving then. The servants knew, but none of them told. Now there was no time left, so we kissed each other in that stupid room. Spread fans decorated the walls. We had often kissed before, but not like that. That was the kiss, that was the life and death kiss, and you only know a long time afterwards what it is, the life and death kiss. So there's this sense that in this kind of window between the convent and Antoinette's marriage, that she's had this greater level of freedom that she's really enjoyed, and that's been taken away from her by her marriage. And there's also this sense that she's had a much deeper relationship with Sandi than with Rochester or any of the other men in her life. The use of pronouns is so important in this novel. You know, if you remember the first line, we've got the they used to say, when trouble comes, close ranks. And Antoinette all the way through has been separating herself, you know, I'm me or we, and we've got they over there. In the early days of Antoinette and Rochester's marriage, there are hints that they might become a we, that they might join together in something quite meaningful. But then towards the end of part 2, it's I and him. But here with Sandi, we've got the we, you know, so this pronoun shows that they are united in some way. And there's also this sexual element to their relationship as well, which is quite unspeakable because of the incestuous element of it. Sandi is Antoinette's half-brother. And for Rochester, this would also be very troubling because of the idea of miscegenation as well, which is a horrible word. But the idea here, I suppose, is that Sandi is Mr. Cosway's son, Antoinette's father's son. So he's got a white father, but he's got a black mother. And for someone like Rochester, the idea of people from different racial backgrounds falling in love or having sexual contact wouldn't have been acceptable. So we've got Rochester's racism here as well, kind of impinging on this and stopping this relationship between Sandi and Antoinette. But the significance of this memory is that Antoinette maybe has been a little bit unreliable as well in her narrative. You know, all the way through part 2 we see her as being honest, as being trustworthy. You know, she's never really done anything wrong herself to make this marriage go off the rails. But actually maybe she has, because maybe there is a relationship with Sandi that Rochester never knew about. So it really throws into relief this idea of the unreliable narrator, and we go back and we question everything that Antoinette has said before. Was she telling us the truth? Why didn't she mention this before? Why didn't we know about Sandi? Why didn't we hear about this at the end of part 1 when she was narrating the time frame that this section is set in? And then at the very end of the novel, we have Antoinette's dream that I've already mentioned, where she sets fire to Thornfield Hall, and then that implication in the final line that she actually does set fire to the house. And of course this reminds us of the fire of Calibri from part 1 of the novel. And that was a fire that destroyed Antoinette's safety, her identity, and her family. It shook the foundations of her existence. It also is a fire that symbolises the racial tensions in the novel, because it is the black people who live near the plantation who set the fire to drive out the white family. And the fire also, at the beginning of the novel, shows the colonial patriarch's arrogance. So Mr. Mason thought he was untouchable. He denied that this fire could ever take place. And then that arrogance was undercut because the fire did take place and did kill his stepson. So the fire comes to symbolise a loss of hope and stability. But on the other hand, it's a way, in part 3, it's a way of Antoinette righting the wrongs that have been done to her. So we've talked already in this course about how Antoinette has very limited forms of empowerment and agency. So she's tried to use words to reason with Rochester, but those words in that language haven't worked. She hasn't been able to get what she wants. She hasn't been able to get a sense of equality with Rochester. She's tried Obeah, so she's used the love potion to try to seduce Rochester, and that has gone drastically wrong as well. That kind of puts the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. She's then tried physical violence, which hasn't worked either because Rochester has always been stronger than her. She's tried pleading with him. She's tried losing herself in alcohol. None of these things have worked. And so this fire symbolically becomes the only way she has of gaining control over her own life, the only way she has of liberating herself from the situation that she's in. So she sets fire to the house, and as we know from Jane Eyre, Antoinette or Bertha dies in that fire. The other aspects of fire that could be interesting, which you'll be very familiar with from GCSE, are that it's natural, that it spreads uncontrollably, and that people often talk about the fires of romantic passion as well. So it'd be really interesting for you to think about how those three very common interpretations of fire might link in with Antoinette's character. Okay, a final independent learning task for you then. I want you to ask yourself the question, what is the cause of Antoinette's madness? And I want you to use these ideas that I've put on the screen, link them up with evidence from the text, and try and link them to your chosen theory as well. So, for example, if we looked at the first one, is Antoinette's madness caused by nature? So many characters believe that she's inherited this madness from her mother, that it's somehow in her nature. So go back to the text, find some evidence that would suggest that this could be an inherited sense of madness, and then, or at least that people say that it's inherited, and then link it to your chosen theory. So for example, if you were doing feminism, you might think about how within a patriarchal society it's very easy to put the blame on the woman and say that women are somehow inherently unstable, inherently irrational. If you're doing post-colonial theory, you might think about how Rochester presents Antoinette as being like the other, you know, as Creole's identity for Rochester has got something to do with being irrational in itself. Okay, so good luck for that. As I say, there probably will be another couple of videos just trying to tie up the themes together. Thank you very much for watching.